The day he left began with the sound of porcelain hour anniversary tea clicking against the sink like tiny bells at a funeral. 40 years shrank to one sentence across the table. I'm in love with someone else. His tie was still crooked from my hands. The space his words carved stayed open. A cold window in July, and all the air in the room went obediently through it. Her age came after her name, as if he had rehearsed the order. Lila, 29. Numbers do not lie. They only measured 40 years against 29 equation that felt like a theft. I watched his mouth shape a future I was not in, and for the first time in decades, realized how quiet the house had been with me doing all the listening. I did not cry. I stood, rinsed the cups, and packed a single suitcase with the calm of a nurse changing a bandage. In the attic, a cedar box waited under winter quilts. Inside were dates, signatures, keys, things a young wife collects without knowing she's building a weapon. I turned one brasky in my palm until the ridges memorized my skin. 40 birthdays, 40 Christmases, 40 thank you speeches at his promotions, with my name missing. A ledger lives inside every long marriage. Deposits of patience, withdrawals of sleep, bounced checks of apology. He believed I would default quietly, but there are entries he never saw, lines inked in my steadier hand, assets titled to the woman he thought was furniture. When he asked if we could be civil, I nodded. He kissed the air near my cheek, spared himself my face, and left his ring-shaped shadow on the table. After the door side shut, I slid the family portrait aside. The safe behind it knew my oldest secret code. The lock surrendered like it had been waiting, and something heavier than grief clicked into place. The silence of a 40-year marriage does not collapse in a single moment. It unravels thread by thread, in gestures rehearsed so often they become invisible. I had carried his suits to the cleaners, kept his calendar, folded our life into neat stacks. And yet when he said her name, all those invisible labors became suddenly audible, a roar beneath my skin. I walked through the house that day as if touring a museum of my own absence. The couch still held the weight of our arguments. The hallway mirror still reflected a younger version of us. But the air carried a different temperature. The faint perfume of a woman half my age, phantom evidence of betrayal already written into the walls. You might think my first impulse was to fight for him, to compete with youth. But the truth was sharper. I fought for myself, somewhere in the attic, behind papers and brass keys. I had proof that my sacrifices had not been donations. They were investments, written in ink that he never bothered to read, and I intended to make him see them. This is not simply the story of a husband's betrayal. It is the anatomy of silence, the slow-burning fuse of endurance, and the moment a woman decides endurance has expired. If you've ever been underestimated, if your years have been mistaken for weakness, then what comes next may feel dangerously familiar. Before we begin, I invite you to stay with me through every chapter. Subscribe, leave your like, and in the comments, tell me where in the world you are watching from, your country, your city, your corner of because this is more than my chronicle. It is a mirror for all who have been left behind and chose not to stay there. The night after he left, the house turned into a theater of echoes. Every door I opened, every door I shut, seemed to answer me with a sound that was too loud, too final. I walked barefoot across the floorboards, and they creaked as though they were announcing my every move. A woman alone for the first time in 4 decades does not move silently. She moves like a storm, trying to remember its shape. In the kitchen, the table still bore his ring-shaped shadow, the faint circle where metal had pressed into wood over years of meals and silences. I traced it with my fingertip, and something inside me shifted. Not grief, not yet. Something closer to accounting. I had given him time, health, loyalty, even the beauty of my youth. And what had he deposited in return? Compliments withheld, apologies deferred, his ambition fattened on my quiet labor. I returned to the attic that night with a lantern instead of daylight. Dust rose like spirits when I lifted the cedar box again. Inside were documents that looked Ordean deeds, contracts, old correspondence, but ordinary papers can become extraordinary when read in the right order. It was like following breadcrumbs through a forest I had unknowingly planted myself. Among the papers lay a folder marked in my handwriting. Joint holdings. At 22, I thought I was being diligent, keeping records in case we ever needed them. At 62, I realized I had been building an arsenal. There were signatures of his on properties he never remembered, accounts he had opened under my prompting, investments that grew in silence while he believed I was idle. I laid everything out across the attic floor until it looked like the wings of a great bird, paper feathers stretching into the dark. Each line of ink was a reminder. I had not been invisible. I had been methodical. The ledger of our marriage had 2 authors, but only one of us had written in margins he never bothered to read. Midnight arrived, and with it, a strange calm. I sat cross-legged among the documents, running my fingers over decades of proof. My hands no longer shook. I was no longer the abandoned wife. I was an auditor, balancing a debt he never suspected. And for the first time since he said her name, I felt taller than the weight pressing on me. Downstairs, the phone rang once and then again. His number, the screen lit up with his name, and for a second, I could almost hear his voice rehearsing civility. He let it ring. I wanted him to believe I was crying into pillows, not rearranging the very foundation of his life. Silence, I realized, was a weapon too sharp for him to recognize until it cut. At dawn, I carried the papers into the study. The morning light made the ink glow like fresh wounds. I arranged the folders on his desk, then slid one aside to reveal the safe. Inside, alongside bonds and forgotten deeds, there was a small velvet pouch. I had nearly forgotten it existed. My heart stuttered when I loosened the drawstring and gold spilled into my hand coins from his grandfather, heirlooms he always claimed had been lost. I remembered the night he told me about those coins. Years ago, after too much wine, they disappeared, he had said, with a shrug. But they hadn't disappeared. They had been in my keeping all along, waiting like witnesses. I closed my hand around them, feeling their weight. Proof of his lies, proof of my memory, proof that the ledger was tilting. Then the sound came not from memory, not from my imagination, but from the hallway outside the study. A slow, deliberate footstep, followed by another, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a house meant to be empty. My breath stopped. The papers lay wide open, the coins gleamed on the desk, and the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob twisted with the slowness of someone who wanted me to hear. My breath became a stone in my chest. Every muscle in my body leaned toward flight. Yet my feet remained nailed to the carpet. When the door opened, it did not creak, it sighed, like it had been waiting for this moment longer than I had. A silhouette filled the frame, tall and deliberate. For a hot beat I thought he had returned, ashamed, searching for me in the ruins of our marriage, but the shoulders were broader, the stance less familiar. This was not my husband. This was a stranger, standing in the threshold of my private war. He did not speak at first. He simply looked at the spread of documents across the desk, at the coins gleaming like witnesses. His eyes flicked toward me only after he had counted the evidence. There was calculation in that gaze, and something colder than curiosity. "You kept everything," he said, his voice low, gravel dragged across stone. My mouth opened, but no sound left it. I had questions that tangled together. Who are you? How do you know what I kept? Why are you here, in my house, in this hour? But my body stayed still, afraid the wrong word would break the balance of the room. He stepped inside, the air shifting with him. In the quiet, I noticed details. A leather coat damp with rain, boots that carried mud from somewhere far, the faint smell of tobacco. Not a burglar too measured for that. Not a friend to cold. He was something else, and that unknown carried its own terror. "He doesn't know," the man continued. "Your husband believes those papers are gone. He believes you never looked, never kept cow. But you did. You have the only map of his real kingdom. My skin burned as if I had been caught naked in my own home. This man was not guessing. He was reciting truths only I should know. He circled the desk, fingertips brushing the edges of the folders. Decades of silence, he murmured. It adds up to something. You've built a weapon sharper than he ever imagined. His words were not praise. They were assessment, like a jeweler weighing a stone he intended to steal. I forced my voice through the fear. Who sent you? It was not a plea but a demand, cracked by adrenaline. Ismailed, thin, slow and unsettling, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. No one sends me. I arrive where silence grows too loud to ignore. He leaned close enough that I could feel the damp chill of his coat. Your husband is not the only one with debts, he whispered, and you, Nora Whitaker, are not the only one keeping ledgers. My blood turned to ice. My name in his mouth sounded like an accusation, like he had been rehearsing it long before tonight. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he closed the safe, gathered 2 folders, and stepped back into the hallway. The sound of his boots retreated like a clock winding down. I ran to the door, but the hall was empty, the night swallowing him whole. Only the papers missing from the desk proved he had been real. And in that moment, I realized I had not been alone in my silence all these years. Morning broke like a bruised purple light pressed against the windows, heavy and uncertain. I had not slept. The stranger's words replayed in my mind, each one a thread pulling loose, the tapestry I thought I had woven alone. You are not the only one keeping ledgers. The sentence followed me from room to room, as if the walls themselves wanted to remind me I was compromised. I checked the study 3 times, hoping the missing folders had somehow returned, but the gap on the desk was as loud as a scream. 2 files gone. One containing joint deeds from the late 90s, the other a record of offshore transfers I had discovered by accident. He had chosen carefully. He had stolen the proof that could burn my husband's empire to ash. The phone rang again, his name. My husband's glowing on the screen. This time, I answered. His voice carried false calm, each syllable rehearsed. I hope you're well. I'll stop by tomorrow for the rest of my things. It was not a request. It was a declaration, as if the house were his stage and I steeled his audience. I swallowed my rage, told him yes, and ended the call with fingers that shook like wires. My mind darted back to the stranger. If he knew of the files, ik knew of me. If ik knew of me, then perhaps he knew of Leela. The possibility knotted my stomach, tighter than betrayal ever had. I was not merely abandoned. I was entangled in something far larger than my marriage. In the attic, I tore through boxers I had once considered archives, birth certificates, insurance policies, letters with postmarks from cities I had never visited, all of them suddenly suspicious, coded, unfinished. Every sheet of paper looked like a secret in disguise. My own handwriting betrayed me, neat, loyal, complicit. Beneath a stack of receipts, I found an envelope sealed with wax, my initials pressed into it. My breath caught. I did not remember sealing it, but the weight of it told me I had. Inside was a single page, dated 20 years ago, written in a hand that was mine but younger. Bolder, if he ever leaves. Remember the Zurich account. My knees buckled. Zurich. The word itself felt like dynamite. I had scribbled those lines in a haze of suspicion during one of his trips abroad. At the time, I must have dismissed it, burying the note in fear of being paranoid. But the stranger had known. Had he read this? Was that why he took the files? I opened my laptop, fingers trembling. The Zurich bank's portal looked the same as it had years ago. I entered numbers from memory, unsure if they were passwords or ghosts. The page blinked, then ballooned open. Balances spilled across the screen. Accounts I had never touched. Millions moved quietly while I scrubbed floors and baked cakes for anniversaries. My vision blurred with a rage so pure it felt like clarity. He had built his second life, not just with another woman, but with money siphoned away under my nose. The empire of silence was not mine alone. It was ours, his and mine, but only I had kept the keys. Now a stranger had some of them too. A crash shattered the moment the sound of glass breaking downstairs. I froze, laptop glowing against my face. The house seemed to inhale around me. Someone else was inside, whether it was my husband, the stranger, or someone new. I knew one thing: the war for silence had just drawn fresh blood. The day he left began with the sound of porcelain hour anniversary clicking against the sink like tiny bells at a funeral. 40 years shrank to one sentence across the table. I'm in love with someone else. His tie was still crooked from my hands. The space his words carved stayed open. A cold window in July, and all the air in the room went obediently through it. Her age came after her name, as if he had rehearsed the order. Lila, 29. Numbers do not lie. They only measured 40 years against 29, an equation that felt like a theft. I watched his mouth shape a future I was not in, and for the first time in decades, realized how quiet the house had been with me doing all the listening. I did not cry. I stood, rinsed the cups, and packed a single suitcase with the calm of a nurse changing a bandage. In the attic, a cedar box waited under winter quilts. Inside were dates, signatures, keys, things a young wife collects without knowing she's building a weapon. I turned one brass key in my palm until the ridges memorized my skin. 40 birthdays, 40 Christmases, 40 thank you speeches at his promotions, with my name missing. A ledger lives inside every long marriage. Deposits of patience, withdrawals of sleep, bounced checks of apology. He believed I would default quietly, but there are entries he never saw, lines inked in my steadier hand, assets titled to the woman he thought was furniture. When he asked if we could be civil, I nodded. He kissed the air near my cheek, spared himself my face, and left his ring-shaped shadow on the table. After the door side shut, I slid the family portrait aside. The safe behind it knew my oldest secret code. The lock surrendered like it had been waiting, and something heavier than grief clicked into place. The three of us stood in that ruined living room like actors trapped on a stage with no script. Rain hissed against the broken window, the curtains snapping like a whip in the wind. My husband's eyes darted between me and the stranger, while the stranger's gaze never left the folders under his arm. I was the only one who seemed to remember the house itself had ears. "Give them back," my husband demanded, voice cracking under the weight of fear disguised as anger. The stranger tilted his head, rain dripping from his collar, a smile ghosting his lips. "You don't give back ledgers," he said. "You balance them." His words cut deeper than threats, because they carried the weight of arithmetic cold, unavoidable, final. I realized then that neither man was speaking about love, betrayal, or even me. They were speaking about debt, power, and inheritance. I was not the abandoned wife in this moment. I was the keeper of evidence both men needed to survive, and that knowledge changed everything. My husband lunged forward, but the stranger moved faster, slipping deeper into the room, boots grinding shards of glass into dust. The brass key trembled in my hand, useless as a weapon but heavy as a symbol. I raised it anyway, the sharp ridges biting into my palm, a signal that I would not step aside. "Nora," my husband hissed, "you don't know what he wants. Bath primera div." He wanted exactly what my husband had stolen: time, money, silence, and maybe, in some twisted way, he wanted me to witness the reckoning. The thought chilled me. Perhaps I was not a victim in his eyes, but an accomplice. The stranger laid one folder on the table, opening it with deliberate slowness. The documents inside bloomed like scars across the wood: deeds, transfers, signatures, and my husband's careless hand. "These are enough to erase him," the stranger murmured, his eyes cutting toward me. "But the rest would erase you both." My husband lunged again, but I stepped between them. The key raised like a blade, For the first time in decades, his body recoiled from mine. He looked at me not as his wife, but as an obstacle, perhaps even as his executioner. And that was the moment I knew the marriage was not only broken, it was buried. So choose, the stranger said, voice low, dangerous. Do I destroy him alone, or do I burn you with him? His hand hovered over the second folder, the one still sealed, the one that seemed to hum with all the years I had tried to forget. The room smelled of wet earth and paper, of history about to ignite. My mouth opened, but no answer came. The weight of decades pressed against me, louder than the rain, heavier than the stranger's presence. My husband's breath came ragged, his face pale, his eyes desperate. Nora, please, he whispered, but the word was no longer love, it was survival. The stranger tore open the second folder, scattering pages into the air like black wings. My eyes caught a single line before the storm of paper blinded me. Zurich Nora Whitaker, co-signatory. My legs buckled. The ledger was not just his, it was mine, and as the papers spiraled down, I realized the fire that would consume us had already begun. When the storm of papers settled, silence returned, heavy but transformed. The stranger was gone, the door left yawning open to the night, and my husband sat crumpled in a chair, his empire of secrets scattered at our feet. I no longer trembled. For the first time in 40 years, the balance sheet of our lives was legible, and it did not favor him. The Zurich account bore my name as much as his, but unlike him, I had not squandered decades in deceit. I realized then that survival was not about clinging to a marriage or hiding from betrayal. It was about claiming authorship of my own story. He had built his kingdom on silence, but I would not live inside its walls anymore. My voice was my inheritance, and I intended to spend it. At dawn, I carried the remaining folders into the light and closed the door on the house that had once been my cage. The keys no longer cut my palm. They opened it Italiano. I did not know what battles still waited beyond that threshold, but I knew I would meet them standing, not bowed. And that was the ledger's final entry. A woman not erased, but